And a good Wednesday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on Rumble and X. Thanks for being here. Don't forget that you can check out the show 24/7 in your favorite podcast app. Just search for the Nick Craig Show wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple, Google Play, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Nick Craig Show and take it with you on demand. You can listen online by visiting the website nickcraig.com. We've got a very busy day slated ahead coming up on Capitol Hill as major media, public media outlets, NPR and PBS, are set to be grilled in front of a House Oversight Committee today. We'll get into those details coming up a little bit later on in the show this morning. First, however, we start with the ongoings in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. The news this morning, delegations from both Russia and Ukraine yesterday agreed on a ceasefire in the Black Sea. This is following talks with the Trump administration officials that have continued this week in Saudi Arabia. The White House said in a following statement, quote, "The United States and Russia have agreed to ensure safe navigation, elimination of the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea." This is a major, major deal coming forward. Seemingly just moments later, the Ukrainian defense minister who is leading the delegation confirmed, quote, "All parties have agreed to ensure safe navigation, elimination of the use of force, and the prevention of commercial vessels for military purposes." So very similar verbiage coming there from the individual in Ukraine, the defense minister who's leading those talks. Though he emphasized that all movements by Russia of its military vessels outside of the eastern part of the Black Sea will constitute a violation of the spirit of this agreement, will be regarded as a violation of the commitment to ensure the safe navigation of the Black Sea and the threat to the national security of Ukraine. That was the defense minister adding on, saying, quote, "In this case, Ukraine will have the full right to exercise the right to self-defense." So things seemingly trending in the right direction. Obviously, we're talking about a major war that has been brewing for years now. So there's going to be some controversy. There's going to be some starting and stopping, but this seems to be a very, very good step. Though the Kremlin also reportedly suggested Tuesday that it may not be willing to fully enforce the ceasefire until it's admitted back into the SWIFT international banking system, calling into question some of the actual successes of those talks. According to reports by Reuters, the Kremlin said a Black Sea ceasefire will only be implemented with the removal of Western sanctions on Russia and their agricultural firms or agricultural-related firms that exist in Russia when accessing the international banking system. The White House has made no direct mention of Russia's demand to re-engage in the SWIFT payment system and did not specify that a ceasefire was contingent on the Kremlin's demands. Instead, the White House said in a readout, quote, "The United States will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agriculture and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions." But the SWIFT payment system is overseen by the central bank of the G10, which include Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States, as well as the European Central Bank as the lead overseer being the National Bank of Belgium. Reuters further reported that the Kremlin's demands that sanctions on food and fertilizer exports and shipments, as well as insurance firms, as well as restrictions on vessels and trade finance operations, need to be lifted. The White House did not immediately respond to Fox News' questions about whether this meant that no ceasefire had actually been fully realized or finalized until the U.S. and its international partners agreed to those ongoing demands. So, as we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, this is not something that is going to happen overnight. This is not going to be a story. It is not going to be a situation that is just magically solved. As much as we'd like it to be, there is a lot tied up in this war. You've had years of bloodshed, years of fighting that have gone on. It's a mess of a situation. It's unfortunately a mess of the previous administration. who did not even bother to open the communication channels with Russia. I still to this day find it just completely absurd that the Biden White House never attempted to contact the Russian president and begin talks of de-escalating this war. You had the president of the United States, this war broke out under his watch in parts of Europe, a war that he seemingly greenlit with his comments of minor incursion this, minor incursion that. And he didn't even open the lines of communication. I mean, when you've heard me talk about this a lot and mention this a lot, when you talk about the previous administration, when you talk about Joe Biden being a weak, useless leader, right? This is what I'm talking about. This is exactly the example. How can you not even open the avenue, not even open the lines of communication? It's insane. But that is exactly what's going on, or exactly what went on, not what's going on, what went on. An administration that I guess just hoped and prayed, closed their eyes and sang la, 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 hoping that the problem would just cease to exist. How is that acceptable? How does that make any sense whatsoever? It doesn't. And so for anybody that is still grasping on to this idea that Joe Biden and the Democrats ran a very successful administration and that the country was so much better off in the United States on the national stage, everything was hunky-dory and good to go. How do you explain this? How do you explain the president of the United States not opening conversation with a major war going on in the country? Or in the world, I should say, not in the United States, but in the country. How do you explain that? How do you twist yourself into a pretzel to justify that making sense? I mean, I'm genuinely asking. Those conversations have since now taken place under the new administration. We're, like 70 some odd days into the administration. Conversations are happening. Things are being agreed upon. Discussions are taking place. Right? You are working towards the eventual goal of ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. That should be the end goal, right? I mean, that's what I want the end goal to be. That's what you want the end goal to be. So why does it seem like everybody's not on that same page? Why does it seem like that's not exactly what some individuals want on the political left? If Joe Biden and the Democrats, who funneled hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, your and my taxpayer dollars to Ukraine, if they wanted this war to end so badly, if they wanted peace so badly, then is it not a fair question to ask, why wasn't that done? Isn't that, I feel like that's a fair thing. I feel like that's a reasonable thing to ask and to demand an answer to. If you guys are so concerned about this, if this is such a big issue, why'd you do nothing? Why did you essentially sit silent and allow this to take place? Now, of course, the left will say, well, we didn't sit silent. We gave $300 billion worth of aid, or whatever the number is, to Ukraine. But you only talked to one of the parties. You didn't talk to the aggressor in the war, Russia. You didn't open the lines of communication to figure out, how do you get everybody sitting around the table? How do you get all of the vested parties together to figure out how to de-escalate this, how to get this under control? And the answer is very simple. Joe Biden and the individuals around him were weak and inefficient at what they did. They were not capable of dealing with a situation like the which we saw broke out under his watch, war in Europe. They were incapable of dealing with that situation, just like many of the other things that you saw over the past 4 years, just completely incapable of dealing with it. And unfortunately, the end result of that has been the bloodshed of hundreds of thousands of people. The end result of that has been hundreds of billions of dollars worth of taxpayer money pissed away for no substantial movements and no substantial gains in Ukraine. I mean, that's the legitimate situation that we're in right now. There's no going back. There's no fixing it. At least with this administration, the conversation is taking place. Will the Trump administration be successful? Will ceasefire talks be agreed to? I'm hopeful. But who knows? You're not necessarily dealing with the best of actors. You're dealing with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has been known and has a long track record of not being the most level-headed guy in the room. I don't think that needs to be said any more clearly. All right, it's a very volatile situation with a guy that doesn't do reasoning very well. A guy that just does whatever the hell he wants and seemingly got the okay to do that from the previous administration. So it's very much an uphill battle, but the ball is being moved down the field. And then that's positive. That's a good thing. This could have been avoided, full out been avoided. But at least if it wasn't going to be avoided, it's something that could have been worked on over the last couple of years. It wasn't. The solution from the Democrats to the war between Russia and Ukraine was just funnel money into Ukraine, who has no shot in hell of winning, has no shot in hell of holding off Russia and their military might. And somehow the war was just going to end. Russia was just going to give up, which was never going to happen. Anybody that is even a minor student of history knows that that's just not the Russian way. They're not going to give up. They're not just going to stop because things aren't progressing very well for them, even though they have not. They're just not going to stop and give up. But I guess maybe that's what the Democrats were assuming or hoping was going to happen. So the conversations are back on. There appears to be, at least this morning, a ceasefire in the Black Sea, positive step in the right direction. We'll continue to track the details. I'll pass them along to you right here on the Nick Craig Show. In some local news this morning, after a successful season for the UNCW men's basketball team, well, and them, of course, winning the CAA tournament, getting into the March Madness tournament, which does continue, unfortunately not moving past the first round, but to be expected as they were a heavy underdog in that tournament. The good news to pass along this morning is that the head basketball coach has been offered a contract extension. According to WECT this morning, UNCW has offered head coach Siddle a 5-year contract extension. According to a source at UNCW, an announcement is expected Wednesday following a Board of Trustees meeting. So that will come up today. This has been an issue for a school like UNCW for quite some time. You build up the program, you have a couple of successful years, and rightfully so, those coaches get plucked away. You saw it with Coach Keats going up to NC State, leading the Wolfpack men's basketball team up there. He was then relieved of his duties just back a couple of weeks ago, or actually last week, I think. But that's been, unfortunately, and it continues to be a trend with a school the size of UNCW, with the size of the program and what they have available. So the contract offer has been made. Will the head coach sign that 5-year extension? We'll have to wait and see. There's something supposedly coming later today. We'll let you know as soon as we find out details on that. So a busy day expected in Washington, D.C., and I specifically pulled this story this morning from the NPR website because they are the center of the attention here. The headline over at NPR, Republican lawmakers seek to put PBS and NPR in the hot seat. Put them in the hot seat. That's the phrasing there from NPR. So I wanted to just read through a bit of this, and then I've got an interesting video that ran on the PBS NewsHour last night. A U.S. House subcommittee has called the chief executives of the nation's 2 largest public broadcasters to Capitol Hill to testify on Wednesday with an eye to wiping out the federal funding for their institutions that they receive. The 2 CEOs, PBS's Paula Kruger, and NPR's Catherine Mayer, appear to be some ways are going to be making their way in front of the U.S. Capitol Hill today, in front of a House subcommittee hearing where that is set to take place. And so their fate is likely going to be faced together as they seek to maintain long-standing bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for funding public broadcasters around the country. This is, of course, as the president, as Trump and his allies have continued to talk about defunding NPR and really defunding PBS, where the vast majority of that money is going is to the PBS entity. So, looking at some of the details and what we are expecting there today, according to the head of NPR, she said, quote, "This could be a perfect storm. That's why this moment does not feel different. It feels like this is the time that we do really need to step up and make our case as clear as possible to the American people." The hearing, entitled Anti-American Airwaves, holding the heads of NPR and PBS accountable, appears arranged more to score points than to find facts. This is how NPR describes it. It will be led by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, whose subcommittee is named after Trump advisor Elon Musk's budget-slashing Doge initiative. She has accused the two networks of profound liberal bias. Profound liberal bias. Does that sound accurate to you? In my many years now of covering and doing a daily talk show, I've covered a lot of stories, a lot of conversation, a lot of articles, a lot of opinion from outlets like NPR and outlets like PBS. And I think the accusation there from Marjorie Taylor Greene of their profound liberal bias, I think carries a lot of weight. And I think is based very much in a sense of accuracy. Greene said in a statement ahead of the hearing, quote, "I want to hear why NPR and PBS think they should ever again receive a single cent from the American taxpayer. These partisan so-called media stations dropped the ball on the Hunter Biden laptop, downplayed the COVID-19 origins, and failed to properly report on the Russia collusion hoax. Now it's time for their CEOs to publicly explain their biased coverage." The efforts to cut funding to NPR has a strong supporter in Elon Musk, who also owns the social media platform X. In 2023, NPR stopped posting on X after Musk first designated the network as state-affiliated, which is the same label given to propaganda sites in China and Russia. Then, as government-funded, NPR considers it's that a broad overstatement and has not returned to the platform. Oh, how brave. NPR giving it to the man. We don't post on X anymore. Phenomenal. So you're not reaching out. You're not reaching an audience. You're supposed to be this public media form. You're supposed to be this outlet that provides information to the American people in this so-called unbiased avenue, this unbiased way. But you're not using one of the largest, most influential, and most important social media outlets of our time right now. Just for that alone, I would argue that NPR is not a legitimate outlet. Just for the fact that they are saying, well, we don't like Elon Musk, we don't like him, and we don't like what he stands for, so we're not going to use X, which could allow us and our message to reach hundreds of millions of people. That just proves the bias, does it not? Guess what? I don't like Elon. I don't like all of the services that I use. I'm not a huge fan of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. However, Facebook is a very useful tool, so I use it. I'm not a huge fan of YouTube and Google and the attempts that they have done in the past to censor individuals that have ideas that are counter to their far-left progressive ideology. I don't like that. But the reality is very clear. YouTube is a very important platform, and it's why I use it. To get the message out to an audience, to meet the audience where they are and give them the content that they want. That's a smart business decision. Now, I know NPR doesn't have to operate in that manner because they receive hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer funds every year. I know that they don't have to operate in that manner, but that's how most people operate. That's how most businesses operate. But NPR standing strong. We don't use X. In separate interviews, PBS's Kergner and NPR's Mayer said they are proud of the coverage that their networks offer and the services provided by public media outlets more broadly across the country. PBS has, for example, a new series called Carl the Collector, focusing on a friendly raccoon with autism. Kerger cites it as an example in which the network serves audiences of broad ranges of interests and challenges, as well as fulfilling its education mission. Nobody's talking about your raccoon show with autism. That's not why you were being hauled in front of Congress this morning. The deflection from these media outlets is absurd. Nobody is talking about Carl the Collector, the autism raccoon. I mean, the fact that NPR put this in their story just goes to show you how out of touch with reality that they are. Don't defund PBS. They've got a cartoon with a raccoon that has autism. Guys, we're talking about your news coverage. We're talking about your far-left progressive ideology that seeps into your news programs. We're not talking about autism. We're not talking about a made-up raccoon. Excuse me, a friendly made-up raccoon. But I'm glad that NPR put this in their story. In addition to providing news coverage such as through NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered, PBS has their News Hour product. NPR and PBS stations serve as a vital component of the emergency broadcast system. NPR's Tiny Desk concerts feature both aspiring and established stars and are a sensation with listeners of both young and old. Stations across the two networks offer shows that sustain distinct musical and cultural traditions in regions across the country, and their news coverage remains free in perpetuity, though some network podcast series offer bonus episodes to paying members. It's a great opportunity for me to tell you about some of the bonus content you can get here with the Nick Craig Show. How about that? That's what we call a transition in the media biz. You can head on over to patreon.com/Nick Craig and get access to things like our daily show notes, all of the various topics, including this ridiculous NPR article available over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. Plus, coming up tomorrow night, our monthly Zoom hangout, which is exclusive to our Patreon members. We'll be chatting news, politics, probably big discussion on this NPR PBS discussion as well. That's coming up tomorrow night, 7 p.m. If you are a member of the Patreon, check your Patreon account or check your email for that Zoom link. 7 o'clock tomorrow night, patreon.com/Nick Craig. I can't thank everybody enough for their support in this endeavor of the Nick Craig Show. So back to the story at hand, this NPR PBS debacle. The public radio ecosystem is sprawling and decentralized. NPR stations collectively reach over 43 million listeners each week, according to the network. Its programming is distributed by more than 246 member stations operating more than 1,000 radio transmitters and frequencies across the country, which together have about 3,000 local journalists. In addition to Mayer and Kruger, the head of the Alaska Public Media, Ed Ullman, is slated to testify Wednesday upon the request of the subcommittee Democrats. A fourth panelist, Michael Gonzel of the Heritage Foundation, as well as a critic of public media, will also be testifying in front of the panel. So with that, I want to get back to this NPR article, and I know this is a lengthy piece, but I think it's a pretty good one. This ran over on PBS last night, the PBS NewsHour. That's their big flagship product that they produce on the weeknights, very similar to the network television shows, or the network, or rather broadcast television news shows that of the likes of NBC and ABC and CBS. So this was about an 8-minute piece that ran on PBS last night. The framing of this is very interesting, and there is actually a couple of interesting tidbits. I'm going to play it. I'll jump in from time to time and comment on it. This is titled "A Look at the History of Public Media in the U.S. as Republicans Target Federal Funding." This is from the PBS NewsHour last night.
His support for defunding America's public broadcasters. It comes a day before the heads of PBS and NPR testify in front of the House Subcommittee on Delivering Government Efficiency, or DOGE. The hearing will examine alleged bias in public media, with calls for federal funding cuts growing louder. That funding, in part, helps support the work of PBS News. We wanted to take a moment to explain exactly how public media is funded and, more broadly, how we got to this point. William Brangham is back with that.
Help me God. So help me God. Congratulations.
In the weeks since President Trump took office, his allies have repeatedly taken aim at the nation's public broadcasters, accusing them of liberal bias.
Pushing leftism.
A liberal indoctrination.
Propaganda from the left, and that's why we need...
Elon Musk has also called for defunding PBS and NPR. Now, allegations of bias and threats to public media are about as old as the industry itself, so it's important to understand the history.
Remington electric shaver.
For a lot of the 1900s, broadcasting in the U.S. was dominated by commercial networks. They sold on-air ads and used that revenue to pay for programming, but some wanted an alternative. So in the 1960s, the Carnegie Corporation launched a study of non-commercial TV in the U.S. and how to bring it to more Americans.
A system that, in their view, could focus more on educational programming, making sure that all members of society have access to broadcast media, going places where there simply were not incentives for a commercial media system.
Now, let me stop this right here, because that is a very valid point. And when you look at the creation of what was PBS, that's exactly what it was intended to do, as an educational resource, as educational television. And I don't have an issue with the educational side of PBS. I don't have an issue with that at all. I've got an issue with NPR and PBS's far left political bias that they seep into everything that they cover. On the radio show last year, we went over the story of the NPR journalist who left the organization after working there for 40 freaking years? He left because of their far left-wing political coverage. His name was Yuri something or other. I don't remember his last name. He talked explicitly about the media bias under NPR and why he decided to leave the outlet. And he had his examples. One of them was the Hunter Biden laptop story. The other was COVID and the unwillingness for NPR to look at the possible origin of the China virus coming from a Wuhan lab, which, by the way, you and I also funded as taxpayers, especially here in North Carolina, because that money was coming from UNC Chapel Hill. Surprise, surprise. So a lot of this piece that I'm running right now from PBS last night focuses on the educational element of it. But again, that's not what is going to be discussed on Capitol Hill today. It's obvious that NPR and PBS are going to frame it as an educational discussion. It's obvious that that's how they're going to lay this out in front of the House. But that's not what's happening at all. That is not the substantive matter that needs to be discussed. More from PBS NewsHour.
A key recommendation of the Carnegie Report was for the federal government to provide funds to help operate stations across the country. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Public Broadcasting Act, which did just that.
Today, we rededicate a part of the airwaves which belong to all the people.
The law led to the creation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB. It's a nonprofit composed of Republicans and Democrats that's responsible for distributing federal dollars out to local stations.
The vision of public broadcasting was that it was a decentralized network of local stations, and local stations themselves should really be at the heart of what public media was.
Almost instantly, public broadcasting began featuring a kind of television no one in the U.S. had seen before.
Oh, hi, Gordon. How are you?
Children's programming like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
It's a beautiful day for a neighbor, would you be mine?
Arts and culture shows like The French Chef with Julia Child.
And this is going to be an all-purpose batter.
And Masterpiece Theater.
By 5 modern English novelists.
as well as news.
Good evening from Washington.
In 1973, Robert McNeil teamed up with Jim Lehrer for gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Watergate hearings. That broadcast eventually became the McNeil-Lehrer Report, and later the PBS NewsHour.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the news.
But there was always something missing, a permanent funding mechanism. The original Carnegie Report had suggested a tax on TV sales to make sure the money wasn't ensnared in the yearly appropriations battle, but that didn't make it into the 1967 law.
When the Public Broadcasting Act passed with no real plan in place to politically insulate public media, it set the stage for, I think, 6 decades now of threats to public media funding, often for political reasons.
So public broadcasting had to regularly fight for its funding. In 1969, one of its biggest stars testified on Capitol Hill.
I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service.
I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
No, this was 1969, right? Very different times than we're living in right now. But let's keep rolling with this.
Fight never stopped.
In the 1990s, what we see are social conservatives who have anxiety about the political direction of some public television programming, joining forces with economic conservatives who think that the transformations in the media landscape that had taken place from 1967 to the present no longer required federal support. The mix of an economic rationale with a cultural rationale to try to dismantle federal support for public media continues throughout the successive decades.
Every Republican administration except Gerald Ford's has tried to cut public media funding. Here's what then presidential candidate Mitt Romney said in a 2012 debate moderated by Jim Lehrer.
I'm sorry, Jim, I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you, too. But I'm not.
In his first term, President Trump proposed defunding public media. This year, Republicans have introduced multiple bills to do the same.
Government doesn't need to subsidize the media anymore because the world's changed.
So that clip there, that is Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana. And for the audio listeners, he's got next to him, he's got some poster boards with some headlines from NPR, the national national public radio as it's described. And the headlines are insane. How racism became a marketing tool for country music. It was an NPR headline. Michael Avenatti, a profile of the media-savvy attorney. Donald Trump's long embrace of Vladimir Putin. This is the kind of coverage, this is the kind of content that seeps out of these public media entities. Nothing about that is unbiased. NPR, and this is more focused on NPR than it is PBS. But NPR is so far to the left in their political coverage on so many of the stories they cover. It's insane. Them and MSNBC are practically skipping down the road, holding hands with some of the media coverage. It's nuts. Yet they'll constantly claim, Paul, you got to save public media. People don't have access. We got to save public media. How will the world continue to turn? How will democracy continue to exist without public media? You guys are bragging about having 43 million listeners a week. You already raised the money. You already do these begathons multiple times a year to raise all your money. Just raise more money. Here's the thing. I don't have a problem with the product. I think if you can self-sustain and support left-wing media, that's great. If you've got a base of supporters that will fund that content and provide the funding, have at it. There's no issue with that. I don't think NPR should be shut down. I don't think PBS should be shut down. I just don't think any taxpayer dollars should go to funding the coverage. There's no justification for it. There's no rationale behind it. If the viewers or the listeners of your content support your coverage, go out and get the money. It's really not that complicated, especially with the audience that these networks have. Self-described by NPR, 43 million listeners a week. Go raise the money. Plain and simple.
Anymore because the world's changed. But I still probably wouldn't object that much if the reporting by these entities was fair and was balanced, but it is not.
We should note here, independent analyses have found both PBS and NPR to be among the most objective and reliable news sources in America.
So yeah, they pull up two graphics here. This is the Knight Foundation and Gallup 2018, NPR and PBS among the least biased, and PBS the third most trusted source of news at YouGov. Being the third most trusted source of news does not make you unbiased. Just because people trust you doesn't mean that the coverage is accurate or that the coverage is unbiased. It means they trust what you're saying. Doesn't mean that it's right. Dishonest framing there from PBS.
Reliable news sources in America. But back to the question of funding. For 2025, Congress appropriated $535 million to CPB. That's less than 1/100% out of the total federal budget. It costs, on average, per American, a little over $1.50 a year. Most of those funds are distributed to some 1,500 local stations nationwide, which produce shows themselves and pay NPR and PBS for the rights to air national shows. But federal funding makes up just a fraction of public media's budgets.
Well, great.
The average public radio station gets about 8% of its revenue from the CPB appropriation. For TV stations, it's roughly 17%.
Okay. Well, then it shouldn't be that hard to replace. If NPR radio is only getting 8%, its member stations are only getting 8% of its funding from the federal government, and while that's a little bit of a blow, that should be able to be easily replaced. Right? I mean, it's a small fraction there, 8%. Now, on the TV side, it's substantial. 17% is a lot of money. But cuts have to be made, unfortunately. We have buried ourselves in trillions of dollars in debt. And so this seems like it's a pretty good place to start. $500 million a year that we're spending on NPR and PBS. So looks like this money should be able to be easily replaced, right?
So to make up the difference, the system relies heavily on donations, grants, and sponsorships.
The U.S. is almost literally off the chart for how little we allocate towards our public media. At the federal level, it comes out to a little over $1.50 per person per year. Compare that to the Brits, who spend roughly $100 per person per year for the BBC. Northern European countries spend well over $100 per person per year. And it really shows in the health of their public broadcasting systems. They tend to view those systems as essential democratic infrastructure. And indeed, data show that there is a positive correlation between the health of a public broadcasting system and the health of a democratic governance.
Now on Frontline.
Federal funding today helps pay for everything from investigative documentaries on Frontline to full-length live concerts. It funds historical dramas and Ken Burns' historical films
that bring our history to life.
Public broadcasting also provides emergency broadcasting services. It's often the last source of news and information during moments of natural disaster. It's committed to this kind of universal service mission that, again, a commercial media system is very unlikely to adhere to.
That's just not true. That is verifiably false, and let me explain. This claim that public media, NPR and PBS, provide critical public services through emergency alerts that commercial entities won't do, that is complete and total BS. I have spent time working in radio. I've spent time broadcast engineering in radio. Radio stations, commercial or non-commercial, are required to be part of the EAS system. That's the emergency alert system. I'm sure that you've been listening to the radio before. You've heard test alerts. You've been listening to the radio before, and there's a flash flood warning or a tornado warning or something, and the station's programming gets interrupted. You hear that loud beeping sound effect come through, and then that voice telling you what the warning is and what the details are. the framing that this is going to evaporate without PBS and NPR is just a lie. And there's no other way for me to characterize it. I know this system intricately, very intricately. I know it very well. I have spent time configuring devices that use it. I'm very familiar with it. That is a complete and total mischaracterization. Those systems exist on all radio stations throughout the United States. And they exist on all commercial television stations. You've turned on the TV, WECT, WWAY, when there's a thunderstorm warning, they've got a little box scrolling at the bottom of the screen telling you what the warning is. When there's a tornado warning, they break into their coverage. Those are private entities. Those are for-profit news networks that provide that coverage. And PBS North Carolina, who produces some good stuff. I appreciate being on their programs like State Lines, their coverage of the governor's State of the State address. Great stuff. They don't cut in when there's a tornado warning and have a local meteorologist telling you what's going on. That's all provided by the private market. That is all provided by private broadcasters. This claim is completely inaccurate. Completely inaccurate. There's no other way to characterize it.
Emergency broadcasting services is often the last source of news and information during moments of natural disaster. It's committed to this kind of universal service mission that, again, a commercial media system is very unlikely to adhere to.
And that mission reaches 99% of the country, with public media stations broadcasting everywhere from South Florida to northern Alaska. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
So there you go. That's the characterization there from PBS. And again, the big focus was on what? The education element of it. Big focus on Big Bird and Mr. Rogers and Ken Burns. I don't think people are objecting to that. People are objecting to the far left political ideology, the high level of political bias that exists in the editorial newsrooms of PBS and NPR. I could sit here for the next 12 hours and we could rattle off and go through ridiculous NPR headlines and ridiculous NPR stories. It's not a secret. They don't attempt to hide it. They put it right out there for everybody to see. And now they're being called on it. Now their heads are being hauled in front of Congress to justify their actions. And now the outrage exists. I don't have any issue with this discussion that's going to take place in D.C. later today. I think it's a good discussion to have. If these entities want to receive taxpayer dollars, I believe they have an obligation to act in a fair and unbiased way. That's my thoughts on it. Now, you can have a different opinion. That's fine. You can disagree with that. That's fine. But I think if the United States taxpayers are going to pony up nearly $500 million a year for public media, there should be some expectation that public media is going to act in a fair and unbiased manner. I do not think that is a bridge too far. I do not think that is outlandish of a request to have. You're receiving taxpayer money. I don't have a choice whether my $1.50 that, according to PBS, is spent on public media. I don't have a choice whether that money is spent. I don't get a decision on if you guys spend that money. I don't get a decision on the coverage that you promote. That money is spent. That money is gone, and I don't have a choice. I just don't. And so the expectation that is publicly funded, the idea that is justifiable for a media outlet of these two media outlets of this magnitude is absurd. You want to talk about funding public media? You know what we should be funding is C-SPAN. You want to talk about a great media outlet that provides you literally gavel-to-gavel coverage of what's going on in Washington, D.C.? It's C-SPAN. I wish that I had more access to C-SPAN. Now, fortunately, they stream their stuff online. They make their things available on platforms like X. Surprise, surprise. It's great, the coverage that they provide. They break into their programming. Hey, big vote going on in the House. Let's listen in. And you just hear what's going on back and forth. It's phenomenal. PBS doesn't offer that. NPR doesn't offer that. That's being offered by C-SPAN, which is what? A private organization funded by cable companies. That's not public media. That's not public dollars. That's private cable entities that are funding C-SPAN and C-SPAN's operation. There's an example of the kind of media, the public media, that I'd be interested in seeing and funding as a taxpayer. I don't need the political spin. Just show me what's going on in Congress. Just air speeches. That's what they do. And they're really good at it. I've been using clips from C-SPAN and watching C-SPAN coverage for like 7 or 8 years now, consistently, religiously. Because when I want to see what's going on in Washington, D.C., when I'm going to watch this House hearing taking place today, I'm going to watch it on C-SPAN. That's where I'm going to get my feed from. They do a really good job. They put the names below the people that are talking so you can keep track of who's chatting and what's going on. They just do a really good job. That is not being provided right now by NPR PBS. So major hearing taking place in Washington, D.C. today. As I've noted, we are at a really tough position financially right now as a country. We have trillions of dollars in debt, and unfortunately, cuts have to be made. And for media outlets that don't want to act in a fair and unbiased and impartial manner, and they want to use their taxpayer dollars, our taxpayer dollars, their resources to push a political ideology, to push a political narrative, to push a political agenda, that money needs to go. We are not talking about the PBS of the 1960s and 1970s. We're not talking about Big Bird. We're not talking about Mr. Rogers. We're talking about an incessant need to push a liberal political bias on both NPR and PBS. And it's time for taxpayers to stop subsidizing that. Plain and simple. I look forward to watching that coming up today. And I'm sure I'll have plenty of clips coming up for you tomorrow morning right here on the Nick Craig Show. Some other news that I am tracking this morning. U.S. President Donald Trump's administration is planning to freeze federal family planning grants worth about $120 million. This is according to the Wall Street Journal last night. The Wall Street Journal said the money for the groups, which include Planned Parenthood and their affiliates, would be held while the administration reviews whether any funds were used in diversity efforts, adding that the pause could be announced as soon as this week. The Department of Health and Human Services told Reuters News last night, HHS is reviewing guarantees to ensure compliance with President Trump's executive order. The answer to this is a very simple one. If you want to continue to receive these federal funds, which I don't think Planned Parenthood should, but let's just play it out. If you want to continue to receive these federal funds, then you need to start operating under the administration. You need to start following the directives of the administration if you're going to be receiving this money. Grants worth about $120 million a year. We're not talking about a small sum here. It's a substantial amount of money. You don't get a choice as to whether you follow the executive orders. You don't get a choice as to whether you follow diversity, equity, and inclusion. That choice is gone. There's new leadership in Washington, D.C. This leadership has an agenda. This leadership has a mandate from the American people. And with that, things have to change. So it has not been officially announced yet, but the reporting yesterday is that this could be coming out as soon as this week. So we'll keep an eye on that and see exactly how quickly that is set to come out. That's going to be another very interesting battle. And I'm sure as soon as the official announcement is made, what is going to happen? Play some Jeopardy music while we're thinking. What could possibly happen as soon as this administration, if they decide that they're going to pause this money? You think maybe there'll be a lawsuit against the administration? You think maybe groups like maybe the ACLU will bring this forward? Shop it in front of a left-wing district judge somewhere across the United States and get a temporary restraining order against the administration. You think that's likely to happen? If I was betting on that this morning, I'd say the likelihood of that is probably incredibly high. That would just be my gut reaction to that. Because that's what we've seen, right? Changes at the administration, changes happening in Washington, D.C., a new administration in place. And what is the end result over and over again? Well, legal challenge this, lawsuit this, temporary stay this, that, all over the place. It's exactly the Democrat playbook. Sue till blue. Can't convince the American people that your ideas are better. Can't convince them that your policies are the best for the country moving forward. Sue them. That's what we've seen. That's been the continuing thread here of the administration. I caught a very interesting piece over at Vanity Fair, of all places, yesterday afternoon as I was perusing the internet and looking for some interesting things to talk about. It's about a new book called Uncharted, written by Chris Whipple, who I don't know any details about him at all. Apparently, he's a contributor to Vanity Fair. And it's a book that talks about the Harris campaign. And it talks about it from the start to the finish, which, if you'll remember, was not a very long campaign. But I just wanted to go through one section of, not the book itself, but the write-up of the book over at Vanity Fair. And it talks about election night. I want to just read through a little bit of this with you because I thought it was very interesting. So it says 107 days later, this is after the start of her campaign. As history will recount, Team Harris hit rock bottom, yet it didn't seem so as Election Day dawned. Though Harris was behind in the battleground states, her spokespeople were oddly upbeat. Appearing on MSNBC back on October the 27th, campaign chair Jen O'Malley Dillon had declared, quote, "We are very confident that we're going to win this thing." On Friday, November 1st, just a couple of days before the election, senior advisor David Plouffe posted on X that late-breaking undecided voters were going for Harris by more than 10 points. As a campaign has gravitational pull, and as Chief of Staff Voles was feeling, quote, "You get sucked into the momentum, like you believe it. I've been on the winning ones and losing ones, and this felt more like Bill Clinton than Michael Dukakis in 1988. Voles wasn't talking polling numbers or analytics, but intangibles. The rallies were so big, so enthusiastic. People were lining up on the streets. But Harris's pollsters didn't share the kumbaya cohesion. One ex-Biden campaign official couldn't understand all the talk that they heard, saying, quote, "They still had constant polling results that showed her down by 2 in every swing state, and Trump always overperforms," saying and telling the author of this book, how the hell were they going to make that up? On election morning, Harris gathered with her family in the front part of their house, while in the back, Nick's and other campaign staff and others were monitoring results. O'Malley Dillon and the company were running the campaign nerve center at the Marriott Hotel near Howard University with an army of data crunchers, keeping Harris and her inner circle informed as the results came in. So, the vice president was hunkered down with her family. Quote, "We saw her maybe one time that whole night," said one of her closest insiders. When the VP came back on their section of the house as the evening wore on, it was an example of, like, what is going on? The second gentleman would come in. Doug would say, "What's happening?" The realization grew that it was going to be a difficult night. One of the key indicators, a photographer and videographer that were supposed to head to Howard University campus with Harris for her victory speech, instead were called off. The moment of truth came just after midnight. O'Malley huddled with her 2 best analytic experts. They were her barometer, her North Star. And when they told her they did not see a path, O'Malley Dillon knew that there wasn't one. She called the vice president and said, quote, "We're down in the blue states and we're not going to be able to make it up." The vice president responded by saying, "Oh my God, what is going to happen to this country?" Suddenly, the race was over. as though someone had thrown a switch. Quote, "We sent people home," said a Harris aide. A Harris confidant was tapped to deliver the bad news to her faithful at Howard University. He took the stage at 12:45 a.m. the morning after the election, and there would be no declaration of victory that night. There would be no Harris presidency. Just after 1 a.m., O'Malley Dillon faced one of her most daunting tasks. She had to call her 12-year-old twin daughters. They had gone knocking on doors for Harris in Arizona that weekend and were totally invested in the campaign. They'd sent their mother a note saying that they were going to bed hours earlier, but they knew the numbers weren't going to turn for Harris. O'Malley Dillon called them on FaceTime to give them the news, and that was the moment with the steady Take No Prisoners campaign that it all broke down. As Harris's devastated followers departed the campus courtyard, the ground was littered with discarded American flags and Harris Waltz posters. The inspiring lightning speed campaign had imploded. So too, in many ways, numerous to count, had its definite theme: we are not going back. I'm going to throw the link to this over in the show notes at patreon.com/Nick Craig. I think it's worth a full read through. It doesn't necessarily make for the best kind of radio, I'll admit. But it goes through everything from before the call was received that Biden was going to be dropping down and Harris would be appointed. It's a pretty interesting piece. I don't know if the book is out yet. Actually, it looks like it is. I'm going to pick up a copy of that because it's very interesting to kind of see this insider look on this stuff. Right? We are used to seeing the public face of a campaign, right? We see the campaign surrogates. We see all the people associated with the campaign on cable news and all over the place. But it doesn't happen very often where you get this nitty-gritty inside detail. So I'm going to pick up a copy of the book. I'm going to be curious to read through it and see exactly what all is on there and some of those details. If I come across anything interesting, I'll pull some excerpts and pass them along to you here on the show. Well, that's going to do it for a Wednesday edition of the Nick Craig Show. Thanks for being part of the program this morning, live on Rumble and X and 24/7 wherever you get your podcast. I'll be watching this PBS NPR hearing in D.C. close today. We'll have the details coming up for you tomorrow morning. Have a great Wednesday.